more there for you.
Okay. There you go. Okay, we're doing John 19:41 to 20:18. There was a garden in the place where Jesus was crucified, and in the garden was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish preparation day and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus in it. Early in the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple left to go to the tomb. They were running together, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and was the first to arrive at the tomb. Bending down to take a look, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he didn't go in. Following him, Simon Peter entered the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there. He also saw the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head. It wasn't with the other clothes, but was folded up on its own place. Then the other disciple, the one who arrived at the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They didn't yet understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. Mary stood outside near the tomb, crying. As she cried, she bent down to look into the tomb. She saw two angels dressed in white seated where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the foot. The angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She replied, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." As soon as she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me, for I haven't yet gone up to my Father. Go to my brothers and sisters and tell them I'm going up to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Then she told him what he said to her. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So at risk of pushing this gardening theme a little too far, the Gospel of John is really growing on me. Especially these resurrection stories in John. They're so intimate, so deeply felt, so visceral. They're not like these dramatic, triumphant stories that I imagine at Easter. They're these intensely personal interactions between Jesus and his friends. A few weeks ago, I talked about Jesus' conversation with Peter on the beach. Next time, Tim is going to preach for us about his conversation with Thomas. But today, we're looking at Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The last time Mary appeared in the book of John, she was at the foot of the cross with Jesus' mother, Mary. They were witnessing the death of Jesus. And in John's version of this story, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus have already buried Jesus with spices. So there isn't a need, as in the other Gospels, for Mary and these other women to bring spices. But after the Sabbath is over, Mary still rushes to the tomb, alone, in the darkness, carrying nothing but her grief. The tomb will be sealed with a large stone, so she won't be able to see him, but she wants to be as close as possible to Jesus' body. Of course, upon arrival, she discovers that the stone has been removed, that Jesus' body is missing, and she's distraught, and she runs to talk to the two disciples who had stayed the closest to Jesus during his crucifixion, Peter, and the one that's known as the one that Jesus loved, who some of us think is John, who wrote the gospel. So these two disciples come to check if Mary's telling the truth. And they race to see who can run the fastest and get there first. And the author also seems to suggest it's a race to see who will believe first, though it's unclear if they're just believing Mary's story or Jesus' rising from the dead. I don't know about you, but this whole thing just reads to me as a bit of a pissing match. And I don't really want to focus a lot on this first part of the reading, but I will quickly mention just 3 things that I think Peter and this other mysterious disciple do for us in this story. First, they confirm that Jesus' body has not been stolen by grave robbers. Looting graves was a common thing at this time, and this might have been what Mary was worried had happened. But grave robbers don't strip dead bodies naked and leave their linen grave clothes all folded nice and neat. Second, Peter and his friend serve, I think, as a foil for Mary. They highlight what makes Mary unique. They rush there and then they rush away, and they do not stay with Mary. They don't even seem to talk to her or share what they have seen or believed. They just run back to lock themselves in a room with the other disciples, which is where Jesus is going to appear to them next. They don't seem to be transformed by this experience. They are still very afraid. And we can give them some grace. Trauma can do strange things to people, right? So the men leave, but Mary stays. Mary weeps. And weeping was seen at that time as a woman's work. And it's still very holy work. So that's the second thing. And finally, I think these 2 men in the story serve to build tension, to build suspense in John's version of this resurrection story, which I find so cinematic. I can just picture the camera, following these 2 as they're running around, one standing outside, one going in, then the other going in, and the camera's cutting between them, and it's panning back and forth. And they rush off anxiously, and we're left with Mary. The camera maybe doing a slow zoom on her as she stays, as she weeps. And I think this is where the story really begins. Again, only John tells the story this way. Only John narrates a full scene around Mary Magdalene and Jesus. The other gospel writers mention Mary as being among the women in a group that sees the risen Christ, or that sees an angel telling them about this. And when Paul retells the story in 1 Corinthians, he leaves out the women completely, so there's that. But John zooms in on Mary, and only John makes a point of mentioning that the tomb is in a garden. And only John starts the story in darkness on the first day. And maybe with the garden and the darkness and the first day, you're hearing echoes of another garden, the very first garden in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God separated the light from the darkness, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And only in John does Mary mistake Jesus for the gardener. Now, her eyes were probably clouded with tears. He was probably backlit a little bit. His body seemed to have looked a bit different post-resurrection. It's an innocent mistake. Or was it a mistake? Maybe Mary was closer to the truth than we usually assume. After all, Jesus doesn't correct her or tell her that she's wrong. He just says her name. He says Mary. And she realizes that the gardener is Jesus. So the theme of my sermon is that Jesus is, in fact, the gardener. And I'm not the first one to make this move from this text. St. Gregory the Great in the 6th century commented on this passage, writing that Jesus was the gardener of the soul, planting the flourishing seeds of virtue. And I discovered this week that in the 16th century, a tradition developed in the art world where artists would depict this scene with Jesus holding gardening tools. And I wanted to show you a few of these art pieces. So Tuesday, could you put the first one on the screen? I just warn you that Jesus is very lacking in melanin in most of these paintings. Here's a woodcut by a guy named Albrecht Dürer in Germany in 1511. I think I especially like Jesus' floppy sun hat in this one. And the next slide, this painting is by an Italian named Bronzino, painting 50 years after that. Not really the most practical gardening attire, if you ask me, but I think there's something very queer about Jesus' gardening clothes here. It's a great painting. This next one is more recent. It's from 2017 by a Dutch painter named Moylwijk. And I really like his overalls here and how there are, you can't really see, but there's butterflies on his hands and his feet on his wounds, this transformation symbol, and a crown of flowers from the tree behind him. And here's the only one I could find where Jesus is not super white. This is a painting by He Qi, a Chinese painter. Not super clear what tool Jesus is holding, but I do really love the colors in this one. Thanks a lot, Tuesday. I appreciate that. So we have a solid tradition of Jesus the gardener. Let's look more closely at the rest of his little conversation, this conversation between the gardener and Mary. Mary is in the garden, and she's bending over to look at the tomb, and the grave clothes that were there for the disciples have been inexplicably replaced by angels, but this does not seem to faze her. They ask her why she's crying, and she repeats what she said to the disciples. She says, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." Her grief here, I think, is so raw, as is her confusion, her not knowing. And I can relate to both grief and not knowing. I feel like they very often go together. And then this same question comes from the gardener behind her. "Woman, why are you weeping?" I hear this not as a rebuke, but as an expression of concern. After all, as Sonia reminded us in their recent sermon, Jesus himself wept in sorrow when his friend Lazarus died outside Lazarus' tomb, even though he likely knew that he would be raising him back to life. Our grief is not a problem to be solved. Our weeping, again, is holy work. But this gardener adds a second question. Who are you looking for? Now that's a question that only appears 2 other times in the book of John, always on the lips of Jesus. Who are you looking for? The last time Jesus said it in this book was in another garden. Can anyone guess which garden? Any guesses? Any online guesses?
It's Gethsemane.
Gethsemane! Thank you, Kate. Yes, the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas and the guards come to arrest Jesus, Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" So many connections to gardens in this last week of Jesus' life. Jesus was arrested in a garden. Jesus was buried in a garden, buried with aloe and myrrh, which are medicines from the garden, wrapped in linen and grave clothes made from plants from the garden. The empire tried to keep him dead behind a stone in the garden, but how could he stay dead when he was a seed planted in a garden? How could he stay dead when he had given his disciples a gardening lesson only a few days earlier, captured in John 12, where he told them, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." And in this garden, this place of fruitfulness, of new life, the gardener speaks Mary's name. In Aramaic, he would have said Miriam. And hearing her name is all it takes for Mary to recognize the gardener as Jesus. After so much not knowing, she is ushered into deep knowing. And after so much uncertainty, she's suddenly seeing it all clearly. Back in John chapter 10, Jesus had said, "The shepherd calls his sheep by name. The sheep know his voice." And now Mary knows his voice, calling her by name, choosing her, and she knows she belongs with him. She is his. And she replies with her own name for him, Rabbi, or teacher, and not just Rabbi, but Rabboni, my teacher. She claims him right back. He is hers. He is the one she has been seeking, the body that was missing, but not a dead body, somehow more alive than ever, this resurrected teacher, rabbi, gardener, standing there, loving her. And in the context of all of this surprising joy and belonging and love, Jesus' next words can sound a bit harsh. He says to Mary, "Don't hold on to me," which ironically is the title of most of those paintings we saw, "Don't hold on to me." Again, I hear it more as a gentle warning, kind of a heads up, that his reappearance doesn't mean a nostalgic return to the way things have been, a holding on to that. Jesus the gardener is doing a new thing, launching a new creation. And if Mary clings to the Jesus she once knew, she'll be hurt again, because Jesus' journey is not complete. He's not staying for long. Jesus has to leave so that Mary can follow him. Jesus needs to send his Spirit so she can enjoy the same relationship with God that Jesus himself has. As he says here, I'm going to my Father and your Father. And this is the first place where he calls himself our big brother. He sends Mary to tell his brothers and sisters, his siblings, about him. We have been transformed into his adopted siblings, and he's making a way for us to follow him home to the love that formed us. To circle back to our gardening theme, Jesus is not only the gardener. In Scripture, he's also called the first fruits. Jesus is like that first blackberry on the bush that ripens in the spring. He's the foretaste, the appetizer, the delicious hint of more goodness to come. And we are all the great harvest that will grow and ripen after him. But before the harvest, there's work to do. There's new work for a new creation on this first day. Of course, in the first creation, the first Adam's task was also to name, just like Jesus is naming here, and later to toil over the hard, thorny ground. But in the new creation, Jesus, the second Adam, has different work because this curse is broken, this curse of laboring in vain. Jesus has the joyful task of preparing a place for us and of sending his Spirit. And Mary also has work to do. Mary's work is to become the first preacher, the first missionary of the resurrection, to gather more siblings into the family. I find it deeply meaningful as a woman, as a female preacher, that Jesus sends Mary to preach this good news to the disciples. Jesus meets a woman in the midst of a woman's work, of weeping and waiting, of not knowing. And do you remember the question he asks her? Who are you seeking? I said there were two other places in John where this appeared. And the first place it appears is in chapter 1, where Jesus' first disciples are seeking him out. And he asks, who are you seeking? And they reply, Rabbi, which is exactly what Mary replies here, except she says, my Rabbi. Mary is called as a disciple in that passage, as a disciple to the disciples, actually. Mary Magdalene, which means Mary the tower, a towering witness to the dawn of a new creation, to the dawn of a new family of God. Mary called by the risen Christ, called by name into this resurrection life, known in the midst of her not knowing, and commissioned to go tell others what she has seen. And to think some people still believe women shouldn't preach. I think it's pretty clear here. Now, I happen to think every Easter sermon should include some exercise of our sacred imagination, some poetic manifestations of resurrection. So instead of unpacking what does this story mean for us and what should we do in response, I want to invite you to join me in imagining a world where we are already understanding and doing it. So I want to ask you, what will help you engage your imagination for these last 5 minutes or so? Maybe it's closing your eyes. Maybe it's finding a pen from the back table and doodling some drawings or jotting down words that resonate with you. Whatever it is, feel free to get yourself into that space of imagining. I'm going to start with the words of Palestinian-Iranian poet Dalia Lina, who writes this: "Let it rain over the empire's flag. Watch the colors bleed. Let the fabric remember it was once thread. Let the thread remember it was once plant. Let the plant remember it belonged to the earth. I manifest all false power, returning to something smaller than soil, than seed, than dust. When the gardener rises, flags decompose and nourish the soil. Because the garden was here long before any empire. And every empire has fallen, will fall, will die. But the garden cannot die. Life is always regenerating life. And so when the gardener rises, wild vines start climbing up the border walls and crumbling them from the outside in. Vines twining themselves into a bridge that everyone can cross over. When the gardener rises, spores will sneak through the wires of the AI data centers, and fungi will dissolve the desolate warehouses from the inside out, turning them into shade gardens where medicines can grow. And when the gardener rises, the oil will rush backwards along the pipelines and back underground where it belongs. And after that, small holes will begin to appear all along the pipes because the gardener is repurposing them into irrigation canals that carry fresh water to barren soil. The gardener once saw his friend Peter unsheath a sword in a garden, and the gardener told him, "No, weapons do not belong in the garden. Those are not the tools I need for my work." So now the gardener is melting down the rifles and hammering them into rakes. He's transforming pistols into pitchforks and bomb casings into bulb planters. He's emptying out the landmines and the grenades of their explosive ingredients and filling them with soil for bursting saplings. I've heard that the leaves of those trees will be for the healing of the nations. Do you see him over there? Don't look for shiny white robes. He looks a lot more like the migrant workers who are growing our food. He's got his overalls on, seeds spilling out of his pockets. His boots are caked with mud, and it looks like he'll never get the dirt out from under his fingernails. Maybe his floppy sun hat feels unbecoming of a Messiah, but he doesn't seem to care. He turns and sees us, and a smile blooms across his face. And now his lips are moving. I think he's saying your name, and he's saying my name, and it sounds like my favorite song. And it feels like I'm being fully seen for the first time. He's so delighted with us. He's telling us we belong here. Empire was no place to belong. Empire was cold and sterile and rigid, and it shamed us into sameness, and that's no place to be planted. His garden is wide and wild and diverse, and he says there's room for us in all our weirdness and untamed beauty. The gardener claims us here, and we can claim each other here. We can flourish together here, tended not by shame, because the cross, the tool of shame, has been defeated. No, we'll be tended by the kind of loving pruning and weeding that transforms us to be even more ourselves. And the gardener whispers, it's okay if, like Mary, you're coming to the garden weeping. Because the gardener has wept in many gardens. He's fallen on his face and watered the ground with his tears. the sweat of his suffering falling like drops of blood. There's still so much to weep about, and we should do it here in the garden alongside him. The soft moss is porous and can soak in our sorrow. And the gardener whispers, it's okay if you're still uncertain, still in the not knowing stage. Gardens grow very slowly, and sometimes it's imperceptible, and some days it's hard to believe anything is happening. All you see is dirt. All you smell is the stench of decaying compost, of manure, of shit. And some days we have to wait like Mary waited, in discomfort and devastation. In Empire, waiting is not possible. In Empire, we're forced to hustle and grind so that those at the top can be waited upon. But in the garden, we can wait with Mary as a form of resistance. We can not know, not understand, not believe, and we can still belong. And now the gardener's beckoning us each over to these different particular corners of the garden, and he's saying to each of us, even while you're weeping and waiting and not knowing, you can garden with me. You can make beautiful things out of dust with me. You don't need to know what you're doing. Just break up the ground, find some fertile soil, something in need of life, some body, some relationship, some community, some cause, and ask for my Spirit to help you practice resurrection there. Weep there, wait there, turn the compost, see the worms work, bear witness, bear pain, bear discomfort, and watch to see what bears fruit. And tend that tender life with me. And with a twinkle in his eye, he says, you know I love to speak in metaphors, but I also mean you can literally plant gardens. You can literally get your hands dirty in this soil I love so much. I love it when you grow things. I love the tomatoes in the pots on your patio. I love when you rewild the desolate spaces, when you make beautiful homes for local species that I delight in, when you fall in love with bodies, with matter, with molecules, with earth. I love to watch you rediscover your place in this vast network of creation, this intricate web that I've helped to weave with billions of creatures thriving together. So go wild, plant things, even if you'll never see them grow. As one of my favorite farmers, Wendell Berry, said, plant sequoias. I will send others to tend them, and the harvest will be beautiful. So we start working with the gardener, tending our corners of the garden, working together without fear, because the gardener is still our rabbi. He's teaching us, he's reminding us that God planted the garden in the beginning, and the garden is always beginning, always reseeding, always the gardener renewing, redeeming, reconciling everything to himself. And even though death intermingles with life in the cycles of the garden, and nutrients are recycled into the soil to create new things, the gardener does tell us that death will not be the end of the story. Because while it's true that the gardener is always beginning, he also said, it is finished. His death and resurrection interrupted the cycle and sent it spiraling toward eternal life. So although weeping and waiting may last for the night, joy comes in the morning. Justice and liberation burst from the ground. No more will we labor in vain. No more hungry, no more pain. We will feast together on the good gifts of the garden with our brother, the gardener, and we will weep no more. I invite you to continue reflecting as we sing this next song.